Do you know why you're here? No, you don't. But you felt it, didn't you? That strange pull, like something was whispering your name through the cracks of history. Listen carefully, because after this, you will never think of power, faith, or family the same way again. There is a name that has been buried for nearly 3 centuries. Whitworth, a name spoken only in sealed court records and whispered in secret societies of the early American elite. Official history paints them as pious settlers, hard-working, God-fearing colonists who built churches and donated to the poor. But that's the mask, the pleasant face worn by a family that understood something far darker, the trade of flesh for power. For decades, the Whitworths supplied the most powerful religious leaders in the colonies with something no scripture could give them: miracles, not prayers, not faith, real physical miracles, healing bones, curing madness, visions of angels, and every miracle, every whispered testimony that God was at work in the colonies came from the same secret source: human remains, processed, preserved, and sold as holy relics. But this isn't the story of desperate heretics or madmen driven by delusion. This is the story of a calculated enterprise run like a dynasty, a family who understood something about human psychology the churches of the time barely grasped. People believe what they need to believe, and they will worship anything if it gives them hope, even if that hope is built on murder. The Whitworths didn't kill for pleasure. They didn't even call it killing. No, what they did was worse. They convinced themselves and the clergy who paid them that they were doing holy work, that by selecting the right souls, saintly women, orphaned children, men of pious reputation, they were accelerating divine will. A lie so seductive, so wrapped in religious authority, that men of power gladly paid for it, and never asked where the relics really came from. Tonight, I'm going to take you into that secret. I will show you how a single family manipulated an entire generation of church leaders, built an underground economy of human sacrifice, and shaped early American religion in ways that still poison it today. And you need to understand something before we begin. Once you hear this, you can't unknow it. You'll start seeing patterns in places you thought were sacred. You'll start asking questions you shouldn't ask. So, are you ready to fall down this rabbit hole? Good, because the Whitworths are waiting. The mask of respectability. The Whitworth family arrived in the colonies in 1741, settling on 15 acres of rolling farmland in Chester County, Pennsylvania, a quiet place where religion shaped every part of life. Nathaniel Whitworth, the family patriarch, was a man people trusted instantly, a master craftsman of religious artifacts, chalices, communion plates, ornate prayer boxes. His work was exquisite, far better than anything local artisans could produce. Ministers and elders from miles around visited his workshop to commission his pieces. They saw him as a man touched by God's grace. But what they didn't see, or maybe chose not to, was the way his grey eyes seemed to study people the way a butcher studies livestock. His wife, Eleanor Whitworth, was a silent, calculating woman, admired for her piety, feared for her coldness, and their children, 4 of them, well-trained, polite, and raised to keep family business locked behind tight lips. At first glance, the Whitworths were the ideal colonial family. They donated to church fundraisers. They hosted ministers for long theological discussions in their candlelit parlor. But every act of charity, every conversation about faith was a test, a way to study the weaknesses of those who trusted them. Nathaniel kept detailed notes, hidden in his workshop, of every person's ailments, fears, and, most importantly, their reputation for holiness. Because reputation was everything. The more saintly the victim appeared, the more valuable the relic. The first confirmed victim was a Quaker woman named Margaret Ellison, a healer known for her kindness to the poor. She disappeared after visiting the Whitworth farm one winter night. Weeks later, Nathaniel presented a local church with a beautifully carved reliquary honoring her memory. Inside, hidden under layers of velvet and gold, was a piece of her. The church leaders didn't ask where it came from. They didn't want to. All they knew was that the relic was working. People swore they felt warmth and healing when they prayed before it. Nathaniel understood what was happening. It wasn't God performing miracles, it was belief itself. The human mind, desperate for hope, did the rest. And that's where the Whitworths found their power, not just in murder, but in manipulating the faith of thousands. Their operation grew quietly, deliberately. Ministers whispered about secret sources for relics that seemed to carry divine power. Money began to flow, and as the Whitworths' wealth increased, so did their hunger, not for riches but for influence, because Nathaniel had realized something most men never dared consider. Faith is the purest form of control. Nathaniel Whitworth did not see himself as a murderer. No, his journal, later found sealed in wax behind a false panel of his workshop, revealed something far more disturbing. He believed he was chosen. In his private writings, he described visions, dreams where angels of bone and blood whispered to him, telling him that God had abandoned the Catholics and that the colonies were to become the new Holy Land. To bring that about, he wrote, "The saints must walk among us, even if we must carve them ourselves." The Whitworths developed what they called the doctrine of selection. Eleanor, his wife, claimed to have the gift of discernment. She would observe churchgoers, how they prayed, how they spoke, how others spoke of them. Her chosen ones were always those with unquestioned reputations for goodness. The more the community loved them, the greater the impact when their relics performed miracles. The first stage of the process was psychological. Nathaniel would visit his chosen victims, offering gifts, asking for prayer, weaving himself into their trust. Only when he was sure no suspicion would fall on him did they make their move. The killings were efficient, methodical. Eleanor prepared the workshop's back room, laying heavy canvas across the floors to catch the blood. Nathaniel, who had once apprenticed under a London surgeon, perfected a method of removing bone fragments, hearts, and preserved skin in ways that looked divine when displayed in churches. The remains were washed in spiced alcohol, treated with salt, and sewn into embroidered pouches by Eleanor and her daughters. But it wasn't just about money or superstition. No, Nathaniel had a deeper obsession. In one chilling entry, he wrote, "Faith is not born of God. Faith is born of spectacle. The relic is not sacred. The belief is. If we can create miracles, we can shape the colonies themselves. We will not just serve God. We will become Him." And for a time it worked. Churches reported healings. Ministers swore their congregations grew overnight. Donations surged. No one questioned why the relics all came from the same quiet craftsman in Chester County. Because hope is louder than truth, and the Whitworths knew how to make hope scream. By 1748, the Whitworth family had created something extraordinary, an underground market for miracles. It started with whispers between desperate ministers, pastors of failing churches who envied the sudden growth of neighboring congregations. A typical Whitworth transaction went like this. Nathaniel would invite a minister into his workshop, offer tea, speak humbly of European contacts who smuggled Catholic relics into the colonies. Then he would casually mention a new piece, a fragment of a saintly woman's rib blessed by the miracles it performed in England. The minister would hesitate. Protestants distrusted relics, but Nathaniel knew their weakness, power. He would offer testimonies of healings, real or fabricated, and quietly suggest that God was rewarding only those bold enough to embrace this new wave of divine power. And they bought it. They always bought it. The first transaction brought Nathaniel more money in one sale than a year of honest craft work. Soon, ministers traveled from as far as Virginia, paying exorbitant sums for relics. Some even smuggled them into their churches in secret, fearing their own congregations would accuse them of Catholic heresy. But Nathaniel wanted more than money. He started mapping influence, keeping meticulous records of which churches grew fastest, which ministers gained followers, which communities whispered of miracles. Each transaction was a seed, and the Whitworths were growing a network of dependency. And then came the children. Eleanor argued that innocent blood holds the greatest power. At first Nathaniel resisted, but the numbers changed everything. Child relics sold for 5 times the price of adult ones. Churches claimed they could feel angelic presence when praying near them. The profits were staggering. By 1752, at least 11 children had vanished from rural orphanages, their bodies processed into tiny, saintly charms. But there was something else, something even more sinister. Nathaniel had stopped believing in God entirely. In his private writings, he admitted that the miracles were nothing more than placebo and fear, but that didn't matter to him. What mattered was control. and the colonies were starting to bend to his will. The Whitworths were no longer just merchants of faith, they were architects of it. Their growing network of churches began reporting not just healings, but visions, angelic apparitions, glowing relics, strange lights seen during prayer. None of it was real, of course, but once a congregation believed it had witnessed a miracle, it became self-perpetuating. People would swear they felt things they didn't feel, saw things they didn't see. Nathaniel exploited this perfectly. He began writing letters under false names, sending them to churches that had bought relics, praising the miracles and encouraging them to share their stories with neighboring communities. The results were explosive. Within a decade, more than 40 churches were quietly dependent on Whitworth relics to maintain their divine favor. Ministers who had once been humble men of faith became obsessed with obtaining more relics, more miracles, more power. But influence came with risk. A few ministers began asking questions. Where were these relics coming from? Why did every one of them trace back to Nathaniel Whitworth? 2 of those ministers disappeared. One was found drowned in a river, the other was never seen again. Both had been scheduled to meet Nathaniel days before their deaths. By now, Eleanor's role had shifted. She was no longer just the quiet, calculating wife. She was the family's spiritual figurehead. Ministers trusted her discernment more than Nathaniel's craftsmanship. Her reputation as a holy woman allowed the family to handpick victims with little suspicion. But while Nathaniel wanted power, Eleanor wanted something else. Her private notes, discovered years later in a locked chest, hinted at a belief that they were genuinely chosen by God to create a new holy order in the colonies. She wrote of visions of a coming kingdom where the Whitworths would rule as saints themselves. And in his mix of greed, delusion, and blood, the Whitworths created something more dangerous than relics. They created a belief system. Not everyone was fooled forever. In 1756, a young Quaker scholar named Elias Cromwell began asking the wrong questions. A quiet man with a mind sharper than most ministers, he noted something chilling. Many of the supposed saints whose relics were performing miracles had been alive in the colonies just a few years earlier. Cromwell began tracking missing persons, marking dates against churches reporting new miracles. The pattern was undeniable. Every time someone vanished, a new relic appeared. He confronted a local minister who had purchased one of Nathaniel's relics, but the minister, terrified of losing his growing congregation, dismissed him. If God works through these relics, who are we to question his ways? Elias didn't give up. He traveled to Chester County, determined to meet Nathaniel Whitworth face to face. That meeting never happened. His horse was found wandering near a ravine. His body was never recovered. Weeks later, a bone fragment labeled as belonging to an ancient European saint appeared in a church 2 counties away. Inside the Whitworth home, Eleanor's daughter, Mary Whitworth, wrote in her journal that night, "Father says suspicion is dangerous, but necessary. He says God weeds out those who cannot keep faith. Mother says Elias has been given a higher purpose now. I try not to think about how he screamed." The Whitworth family didn't just silence dissent, they erased it. And yet, a seed of doubt had been planted. A few quiet men of influence began whispering, wondering why miracles always followed tragedy. Nathaniel took this as a challenge. Instead of laying low, he expanded his operations, determined to drown out any suspicion with overwhelming proof of divine power. That arrogance would cost him later, but for now it only made the Whitworths more dangerous. By the 1760s, the Whitworth family had moved into their most profitable and most horrifying phase, the orphan harvest. Eleanor claimed that God had revealed a new truth to her. The purest relics come from those uncorrupted by the world. Children, orphans, innocence. Nathaniel hesitated at first, but William Whitworth, the youngest son, argued convincingly. Ministers will pay anything for the power of a child's heart, and no one will ask questions when orphans vanish. So they began targeting church-run orphanages. Small, weak children with reputations for piety were chosen. They would simply disappear, and within weeks, glowing stories of miraculous healings would spread through churches displaying their relics. The process became an assembly line. The Whitworth cellar was redesigned into a grim workshop. Stone tables for dissection, racks for drying tissue, iron cauldrons for boiling bones. Eleanor kept meticulous records of each victim's spiritual purity, convinced that the more devout the child, the stronger the miracles. Between 1761 and 1767, at least 27 children vanished from Pennsylvania and New Jersey orphanages. Each one became a relic. Each one fed the Whitworths' growing fortune. And they were careful. They bribed orphanage workers. They spread rumors of Indian raids and child traffickers. No one looked too closely. But one man did. And he would be the first real threat to the Whitworth dynasty. His name was Samuel Winters, a physician from Lancaster. Unlike most ministers, Winters believed in science. He was skeptical of miracles, but when a patient begged him to examine a relic that had supposedly healed her, he agreed. What he found shocked him. The tissue in the relic was fresh, far too well preserved to be centuries old, and the preservation method used was something he recognized, not ancient Catholic technique, but modern medical practice. Winters quietly began investigating. He traced several relics back to the same source, Nathaniel Whitworth. He wrote to a colleague in Philadelphia saying, "These relics are not holy. They are recent. The flesh is no more than a few years dead. There is a crime here, hidden beneath piety." But Winters never finished his investigation. In March 1768, he vanished while traveling to Philadelphia to present his findings. His horse was found on the road. His satchel containing his notes was missing. A month later, a new relic appeared in a church in New York, a fingerbone of a child martyr. The Whitworth family tightened security after that. Ministers who questioned too much simply disappeared. And yet, the walls were beginning to crack. Too many vanishings, too many coincidences. The whispers were growing louder, but Nathaniel believed he was untouchable, and in his arrogance, he made a mistake that would set his downfall in motion. The mistake was Daniel Foster, a young apprentice Nathaniel trusted too much. Daniel had worked in the workshop for 2 years, crafting chalices and prayer boxes. He believed the family's holy reputation until one night in 1771 when William Whitworth, drunk on whiskey, invited him into the cellar. What Daniel saw shattered him. The tables, the blood-stained tools, the racks of preserved flesh. William, laughing, told him everything. He described the doctrine of selection, the orphan harvest, the money flowing from ministers desperate for power. Daniel didn't sleep that night. The next morning he fled, leaving his apprenticeship unpaid, vanishing into Philadelphia. For years he kept silent, terrified, but by 1778 he had begun quietly sharing what he knew with a few trusted men of influence. One of them was Elijah Thompson, a Quaker minister with a reputation for uncovering church corruption. And Elijah Thompson was not a man who could be silenced easily. Elijah Thompson approached the investigation like a hunter stalking prey. He didn't accuse anyone outright. Instead, he followed the money. He visited churches across Pennsylvania, asking quiet questions. Where had they obtained their relics? Who had recommended Nathaniel Whitworth? What miracles had they seen? The answers confirmed his worst fears. In his journal he wrote, "The same name appears too often. The same families vanish before the same relics appear. It is no divine work. It is slaughter disguised as holiness." Thompson began gathering evidence, statements from ministers, secret testimonies from orphanage workers, and finally, a meeting with Daniel Foster himself. Daniel told him everything. Thompson planned to present his findings to the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, the highest Quaker authority in the colonies. But Nathaniel had already learned of his investigation, and the Whitworths were desperate enough to do something reckless. The night the Whitworth farm burned was not an accident, at least not in the way the official records claim. Witnesses in Chester County reported a strange glow from the cellar windows long before the fire erupted, a soft, pulsating light, almost like candlelight reflected on wet stone. Then came the screams, 3 distinct voices, one male, one female, and a child's. The first neighbors arrived just as flames burst from the workshop roof. The air was thick with the smell of burning wood and something else, the stench of charred flesh. But what unsettled them most wasn't the fire. It was the sound. Several men swore they heard chanting, low and rhythmic, echoing from the cellar even as the building collapsed. By dawn, the Whitworth estate was reduced to smoldering black beams. The authorities arrived, sifting through ash, pulling out what was left of the bodies. Nathaniel Whitworth's remains were identified only by his iron signet ring, found fused to a skeletal hand. 2 more partial skeletons were recovered, assumed to be 2 of his children, but something didn't add up. There weren't enough bones for the entire family. Eleanor's body was never found, neither were William's or Sarah's. One investigator noted claw marks on the inside of the cellar door, as though someone had tried to escape. Another wrote that the stone floor beneath the ashes was strangely clean, as if it had been scrubbed before the fire. Most curious of all was the discovery of a burned leather-bound book near the ruins. The few legible pages contained sketches of human anatomy and preservation methods far beyond what was common in the colonies. One passage, scorched but still readable, read, "The fire must be absolute, flesh must be erased, or the faith collapses. But some vessels must survive, for the work must continue." What vessels meant was never officially explained. The fire was rule, an accident caused by improper storage of oils and flammable substances. But people in Chester County whispered that it was no accident at all, that the fire was either a ritual cleansing by the Whitworths themselves or revenge by ministers who wanted their crimes erased forever. Either way, the Whitworths' reign of terror was over, publicly. But as we'll see, the truth was never buried in those ashes. The truth should have ended that night. The Whitworths should have been condemned as murderers, their names cursed in every church. But that's not what happened. In 1782, Elijah Thompson finally presented his findings to the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, the highest Quaker authority in the colonies. His evidence was overwhelming. Daniel Foster's testimony, journal pages from Sarah Whitworth, lists of missing orphans, and, most damning, his own records tracing the sudden appearance of relics after every disappearance. When he finished, the room was silent. Not because they didn't believe him, but because they did. The leaders argued for hours behind closed doors. Thompson demanded that they expose the truth, warn the people, and destroy every relic connected to the Whitworths. But others disagreed. They feared what would happen if the story became public. Hundreds of churches had used Whitworth relics. Thousands had believed in their miracles. "If we reveal this," one elder whispered, "we don't just destroy the Whitworths, we destroy the faith itself." In the end, power won over morality. The official ruling was written in carefully chosen words. "For the preservation of public order and the stability of the church, these findings shall remain sealed." Thompson was ordered to hand over all his documents. He protested, he shouted, but he was outnumbered. His journal, along with Foster's testimony, was locked away in the Philadelphia Historical Society, sealed under a legal order that would last centuries. To make sure no one ever spoke of it again, ministers were quietly instructed to either destroy Whitworth relics or hide them. Most chose to keep them. A few even buried them beneath church altars, unwilling to let go of their miracles even after knowing where they came from. Thompson left that meeting a broken man. In his final private entry, smuggled out before his death, he wrote, "I thought I was fighting evil, but I see now the evil was never just the Whitworths. It was the machine that used them, and still uses them, to control men's souls." And that's the part of the story no history book will ever tell you, because the ones who write history are the same ones who seal it. If the Whitworth fire had truly ended their legacy, this would be where the story closes, but it didn't. For decades after the fire, rumors persisted that Eleanor Whitworth and her youngest son William survived. Witnesses claimed to see a pale, stern-faced woman traveling westward with a boy whose gaze was too sharp for his age. In 1823, when workers demolished the last standing remains of the Whitworth estate, they uncovered something chilling, a wax-sealed journal hidden beneath a stone floorboard. The handwriting matched that of Sarah Whitworth, the eldest daughter. The final entry shattered any hope that the family's madness had died in the fire. Mother says the work must continue. She says the fire was Father's weakness, not God's will. We are chosen still, and the new land will need saints. William has learned more than Father ever did. He says the flesh can be preserved forever now. We will not fail. After that discovery, strange stories began to surface in frontier towns. Ministers whispered of miracle relics appearing in newly built churches across Ohio and Kentucky, relics that worked faster, more convincingly than ever before. A traveling preacher in 1831 wrote of a mysterious woman who approached him after a sermon, offering him a true saint's heart preserved by holy means. Her description matched Eleanor Whitworth. She was reportedly accompanied by a tall, gaunt young man with piercing eyes who said nothing during the exchange. Were these sightings real, or just fear keeping the legend alive? No one knows for sure. But one thing is certain. The techniques the Whitworths developed did not die with them. Some were copied by others, passed quietly through secret religious circles. And even now, in certain old churches, relics are kept locked away in sealed cases, never shown to the public. Relics whose origins no one dares to question. Because if you start asking where they came from, you might find the Whitworths never really left. This is the part you're not supposed to understand. But you will, because you're not like them, are you? The Whitworths were not just killers, they were engineers of belief. They understood a truth that modern institutions still use today. Faith is the easiest weapon in the world. Give a man hope, and you own him. Take away his hope, and you break him. But give him a miracle, something he can touch, something he can whisper about in the dark, and he will crawl on his knees for you. Nathaniel understood this when he wrote, "The relic is not holy, the belief is holy. If we can create the belief, we can create God himself." Think about that for a moment. The Whitworths didn't just sell bones, they sold control. Ministers became addicted to them, congregations became addicted to miracles, and no one cared where they came from, as long as the hope kept flowing. Sound familiar? Look around you. The names have changed, the buildings have changed, but the machine hasn't. You're still being fed hope and fear in carefully measured doses. And now you know why. Because once you understand how easily the Whitworths manipulated entire communities, you start to see the same pattern everywhere. The question is, will you close your eyes like everyone else, or will you keep them open? You felt it, haven't you? That weight in your chest, that quiet voice whispering, "This world is not what they told you it is." The Whitworth story isn't just history, it's a mirror. It shows you how power works, how belief can be bent, how good men can be turned into tools, and how easily a single family manipulated thousands. Now you know the truth. And once you know, you can't go back. You can't pretend you didn't hear it. This is where it begins for you. You can either look away, let this knowledge fade, and go back to being another obedient believer in whatever story they feed you, or you can become something else. The men who wake up, who see through the lies, are the ones who change everything. But first, you need to prove to yourself that you're not like the others. So write this in the comments twice, so it locks in your mind. I see through the Whitworths. Not for me, for you. Because if you can see through the Whitworths, you can see through anyone. And once you see, you can never be controlled again.